The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You're welcome.
I want to congratulate the Minister on his address to the House in relation to this bill as the new Minister taking over this particular responsibility. And I really wanted to endorse the words that he used. There were two words, and they were strengthen integrity. Strengthen integrity. That's actually what this bill is about. And I just want to remind people about an answer to a series of questions that were put to the Prime Minister last year. The issue of ethical standards applies to ministers when they are holding their warrants. As the member should know, the Cabinet Manual makes it quite clear that when it comes to ethics, it is at the time the person holds their warrant. I am satisfied that the Minister has given me an assurance, which is the test, that he has done everything in accordance with the law. There is quite a wide definition of ethics. The test I have to apply is the law. Well, I just want to remind this House why we are debating the local Electoral Amendment Bill number 2. It is because somebody couldn't define the difference between compliance with the letter of the law and an understanding of what ethics might actually stand for. Let me quote from the police report into the John Banks affair. The police investigation established that on the 24th of May 2010, Mayor John Banks met with the Chief Executive Officer of Sky City Entertainment Group Limited. At that meeting, Mayor Banks received a sealed envelope containing a $15,000 cheque written out to Team Banksy 2010. Team Banksy. Well, I think it was in an envelope because that enabled things to be sort of kind of, I think it allowed brain fade to take effect, because I've actually renamed this bill the brain fade bill, because what it does away with is the capacity for individuals to suffer from brain fade. Anonymous donations beyond $1,500 will actually be referred to the Electoral Commission. Team Banksy was the name given to Mr Banks's campaign organisation. This donation was subsequently recorded in the electoral return by the Treasurer for Team Banksy as anonymous. Did Mr Banks know where the money had come from? Yes, he did. Did he know that it had been recorded subsequently as anonymous? No, that's where the grey area was, and that is how he wriggled out of that particular prosecution. And so what the police said, police are therefore of the view that there is insufficient evidence to consider a prosecution, not because they didn't think that Banks knew that where the money came from, he just didn't know that they'd recorded it as anonymous. We believe that. Police have established that in September 2010, Mr John Banks personally solicited a request for help from a donor who prefers to remain anonymous for the purpose of this correspondence, quoting from the police report. As a result of a discussion between the two, it was agreed that the donor would help with a donation of radio advertising for the campaign. The donation was recorded on the return by the Treasurer for Team Banksy as an anonymous donation. Police were unable to establish that Mr Banks had the necessary knowledge that the donation had been recorded as anonymous in the return before he signed and submitted it. Mr Speaker, let's quote a little bit further. Police have established that on the 9th of June 2010, Mr John Banks personally solicited a donation from Mr Kim.com. This request resulted in Mr Kim.com paying two $25,000 donations. Both donations were subsequently recorded as anonymous, and here's the quote again from the police report. Police were unable to establish that Mr Banks had the necessary knowledge that the donation had been recorded as anonymous. Mr Speaker, we are here debating this legislation on a subject that the Minister completely failed to mention. We are here because John Banks failed to act in an appropriate way when he was standing for the mayoralty of Auckland. And actually, he didn't win the mayoralty of Auckland, and Aucklanders are very grateful for that fact. But he has come back to Parliament and he has found that it doesn't matter how he behaved when he was a candidate for the mayoralty, because our Prime Minister thinks it's okay to behave that way when you're a candidate for the mayoralty, as long as you don't have a ministerial warrant in your hand. Well, I don't think that that is acceptable, and actually the people of New Zealand don't think it is acceptable either. Mr Speaker, I still find it utterly extraordinary that John Banks cannot remember flying in a helicopter to a large, ostentatious property owned by a large, ostentatious multi-millionaire. I don't know any ostentatious multi-millionaires myself, but the reality is that this is not an everyday activity for anyone, and yet he has completely and utterly overlooked the fact that nobody can accept that. Mr Speaker, if we think of the amount of time and effort that Parliament has had to invest in addressing this particular matter, Mr Speaker, one has to ask if this is the best use of Parliament's time, if we're not even prepared to front up and talk about the real reasons why we are here. Mr Speaker, we had a Prime Minister that campaigned from one end of the country to the other in 2008 on holding a referendum on MMP. He said, we're going to have a referendum on MMP, we're going to let the people of New Zealand kick the tyres. I remember him saying that, kick the tyres, because it's an expression that he used to use quite a bit. But he said we were going to kick the tyres on MMP. The referendum was held. What happened with the referendum? Did we get rid of MMP as he wanted? No, we didn't. We kept MMP. So what was the trade-off for keeping MMP? We were going to have a review of MMP because there were elements of it that people knew that they wanted to see changed. What's happened to the review? Well, the Electoral Commission held their own review because the government refused to provide them with any terms of reference. They went to the government and said, have you got any terms of reference for us? And the government just didn't even reply. And so the Electoral Commission, feeling that they had a responsibility, they went ahead and they held their review of MMP, and they came up with some suggestions. A pretty major suggestion also comes back to John Banks, and the major suggestion that they came back with was that we had to fix the thresholds. We had to reduce the threshold from 5% to 4%, but more importantly, that was the quid pro quo for getting rid of the one-seat threshold, the John Banks threshold, the cup of tea threshold that everyone now knows that the people of New Zealand don't want. But the government hasn't introduced any legislation to address that issue. We're dealing with the other John Banks issue, the issue of brain fade. Mr Speaker, I think it's really important that this government actually looks at what the real recommendations are in this area, what we need to be doing in order to ensure that we have a robust electoral law system in this country. Mr Speaker, if he wanted to address those real issues, we wouldn't be addressing this now. We would be addressing those other issues so that when we get to the general election next year, we deal with those fundamental changes that people want. He has rorted one system after another. That's what John Banks is responsible for. That's his legacy to this House. We're fixing one of those rorts tonight, and yes, we will support this legislation for that reason. It does need to be addressed. We do need to align the general election law with the local body law. That's what we need to do. But there is another law that needs to change as well, and that's our general election law. We need to make sure that the rort that John Banks also stands for on the other side of it is dealt with as well. Mr. Speaker, we have to find ourselves addressing the excesses of behaviour on both sides of that spectrum, and I believe that it is absolutely irresponsible of the Prime Minister of New Zealand not to front up to this most basic of issues in the House.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the new chairman of the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, it's a great pleasure